Chapter 1, Introduction to Writing. This is Section 1.3, Using Sources. What are sources and how do you use them in college? Well, a source is anything that you didn't write or create. A source is anything that you are using to build something that you are writing or creating. For the most part, you will use sources when you write research papers. But from this point on, as a college student, you will generally use sources for all of your college assignments. So our two goals in this section: first, to use sources effectively by thinking and writing about them critically. And then second, to use sources responsibly by acknowledging the ideas and words of other writers as you incorporate them into your paper. Determining what to acknowledge. Now, at some point, we have things that are common knowledge, and these are well-known facts, non-controversial information, or information that is available in a variety of sources. For example, most of us know the Titanic hit an iceberg. This is common knowledge. You generally wouldn't need to source it. However, if you ever have any question, it is better to err on the side of caution and always acknowledge a source. And that way you don't commit accidental plagiarism, which is bad news. A research paper not only describes what others have discovered, but also points out the connections between those discoveries and explains the writer's response to them. When you use a source in your paper, you do not simply place a quote down or a section of the argument. You're going to need to interact with that source. You're going to have to talk about it. You may ask questions about it. And we'll talk about that a little later in this Google Doc. So first, to use sources effectively. 1, you can think and write about the source critically. You could begin by asking yourself the 5 W's: who, what, where, when, why. And then number 2, acknowledge the ideas and words of other writers as you incorporate them into your paper. You are going to need to use in-text citations in your papers, and also you will have a works cited / reference list depending on the format that you're using, whether it be MLA or APA. Why do you have to involve sources in your writing? Let me tell you. There is a larger philosophical reason. When you write in academia, you take part in a conversation that has gone on for centuries before you and will go on long after you. Sounds like a very Star Trek example. But using these sources, that's how you become involved in this conversation that will continue throughout time. You use the sources, you will interact with them, and in this way you can converse with colleagues, professors about this particular topic. And this dialogue will compose a large measure of your learning. Depending on the size and the scope of the writing project, you may have to build arguments based on sources that you've read in class. You may have to write an argument based on research sources, or you may have to write a personal response to a course or text. Summarization and analysis is also a part of research. You may be asked to do that in a class. In short, you will need to support what you communicate in the college classroom. You will need evidence. Sources, those are your evidence. What kind of sources should you use? Well, first off, you should always use scholarly sources. These are peer-reviewed sources, and we'll talk about scholarly sources in a future Google Doc, but they must always be scholarly. Wikipedia, Wikipedia, SparkNotes, eNotes, eBib, all of that, not a scholarly source. So from this point on, just forget those guys exist. But once you do find a scholarly source, these are ways that you will use them within your own essay. First, you may use a direct quote, which is the exact wording from the scholarly source. You will use a quote to retain the beauty or clarity of someone's words. You can also incorporate a source into your paper by using a paraphrase. And a paraphrase is when you put a passage or part of a text in your own words. So you take somebody's information and then you sort of place it into your own words. Paraphrase is good to use when you need to clarify difficult material, or you are using someone else's ideas, but you do not want to use the exact words because you need to create a consistent tone. So, for example, if the scholarly source is a cardiologist, but yet the audience of your paper is sort of a general knowledge group, and they're not going to be able to handle the high level of diction that the cardiologist would probably utilize within his paper. So you would need to paraphrase. You would need to simplify the language in order for your audience to understand it. And last is summarize. You can summarize a portion. It's where you give a broad overview of a passage, and then you give a summary in 1/10 of the size of the original text. So you're going to omit much of the detail. However, you're still going to retain the essence of the work. I made you a handy dandy chart here. Kind of gives you a quick little summarization, omits much of the detail. It's shorter than the original, and it just gives you the gist of the writer's main idea. And then you have your paraphrase over here, a restatement of someone else's ideas in approximately the same number of words. So summary is shorter, paraphrase about the same number, and a paraphrase should almost be entirely in your own words and should convey the content of the original passage. Also paraphrase and quotations. So you can use a paraphrase to clarify difficult material, the tone, we've already spoke about that, and interact with a point that a source has made. And then your quotations. So you can look at that. Explicating sources. In addition to properly introducing and documenting sources, writers need to explicate quotations and paraphrases. Basically, explicating sources means justifying their place in the work. So, you find a source, you believe it will help your topic, you must justify why you presented that source in your paper. And these are sort of little helpful tips, ways to incorporate those. So you can use in other words, so then you can tell your readers what the quotes or paraphrase means. You could go on to show how that source supports your argument. Tell your reader how this quote or paraphrase is evidence that supports your argument. Or you can do context, provide some context for this quote or paraphrase. You can ask, what is the author of the source doing or trying to do in this section or passage, and then you can discuss it with your reader. So you must never ever just plop down a source and then leave it. You must interact with it. Here are some tips. You should restrict direct quotations to when an author says something that just can't be paraphrased. In MLA, especially when you're in a literary class, you use a lot of direct quotations, poetry, stories, because you want to retain the beauty of the writer's original text. You can quote when authors say something especially relevant or meaningful, something that that can only be said the way the author said it. You should always use quotes sparingly. For most of the papers you write, you won't need very long quotes. A good guideline is to use no more than 3 sentences. And then do not rely on block quotes. Use those only when absolutely necessary. A lot of times I see a lot of block quotes when people are trying to meet a word count, so be very careful about not committing that sin. Always use signal phrases when introducing a quote or summarization. Do not simply begin a sentence with the first word of a quotation. You're going to need to say something like, for example, or in order to. These things are signal phrases. You must always begin a quote or summary with a signal phrase. Now, whenever you are interacting with direct quotes, sometimes you may not want to use the entire quote. So your best friend, when this occurs, are square brackets and ellipses points. Square brackets, these guys set off additions or alterations that clarify direct quotations. Also, they note a change in upper to lower or vice versa capitalization of letters. When you place a direct quote in your essay, you still need to maintain the correct grammatical structure of your sentence. So sometimes you have to change capital letters to lowercase letters, that sort of thing. And when you make any alteration whatsoever to a quote, you have to place that alteration in a square bracket. Also, you may need to change a verb tense. Perhaps it's jumped and it needs to be jumping. Then you'll place the ing in square brackets. Also, if you need to specify a pronoun, perhaps the chunk of the sentence that you have taken says, he emancipated the slaves. Well, if you're only going to use that one section, you don't know who he is. So you'll place in square brackets, Abraham Lincoln emancipated the slaves, because you added Abraham Lincoln because the original author of that source put he. So you're just showing that you changed something. Ellipses points, those are the ... Yes, they have a name. They are ellipses points. You will use these guys to mark an omission. Say you want to take a chunk of the sentence out. Then you will place the ellipses. Or to mark an incomplete sentence, you just want to use the first part of a sentence, and then you're going to take the rest of it out. You will mark that omission with your ellipses. So, 3 ways to avoid plagiarism. Plagiarism is bad. It's so bad. It can make you fail a class, and that is no good. So, always give a source. When in doubt, source. If you paraphrase within an essay, even because a paraphrase is your own words, right? You're taking something and you're changing it into your own words, but still, the idea is not originally yours, so you must document. You must have an in-text citation. And with a quote, you will also always have an in-text citation, so make sure you give the source. So, we talked about this. How do you use your sources? Well, in your writing. Well, you have to use quotes, paraphrase, summarizations, and you have to give those in-text citations. That's how you become an ethical writer. And an ethical source, using a source ethically rather, means giving credit, and it also means providing the required information about the source, whether it be in-text citation, that the source is placed on the works cited / reference page at the end of your essay. Guidelines for source use. Make sure you have permission to use the source. For the most part, you can use a small part of any written text in something that you create for school, but you still need to place that in-text citation. You need to make sure that you are using the proper format. Know if it is in MLA or APA style. And you must include the full citation for the source at the end of your paper. That includes page number, publication date, author. So make sure, complete source. And then I will end here with a terrible warning. Taking even part of someone else's work and presenting it as your own leaves you open to a failing grade. I know in some larger universities they can kick you out. So plagiarism is a big deal, so make sure that you are very aware of that.